Season 6, AI and Surveillance. Episode 4, How Surveillance Became Normal. One. Introduction. Nobody voted for this world. If you asked people decades ago whether they wanted to be tracked, most would have said no. Tracked by cameras. Tracked by phones. Tracked by platforms. Tracked by employers. Tracked by advertisers. Tracked by governments. And yet here we are. A world where surveillance is normal. Not because one law forced it. Not because one dictator imposed it. But because surveillance arrived through convenience, fear, profit, and habit. It arrived in pieces. And each piece seemed reasonable on its own. A camera here for safety. A login there for security. A phone feature for convenience. A personalized feed for relevance. A workplace tool for productivity. Then the pieces connected. The result is a society where being watched is not an exception. It is the default condition. This episode explains how surveillance became normal, step by step, why AI accelerates normalization, and why reversing it is so difficult once people adapt. 2. Surveillance used to be expensive. To understand normalization, start with the past. Surveillance used to be expensive. If you wanted to watch someone, you needed people to follow them, people to listen, people to record, people to analyze. Mass surveillance existed in some authoritarian regimes, but even then it was constrained by manpower and cost. There were limits. A state could monitor dissidents, but not everyone. A company could track customers through surveys, but not every movement. A boss could supervise a worker, but not every keystroke. Cost acted as a brake. When something is costly, it is used selectively. 3. Digital life removed the cost brake. The first major shift happened when life moved online. When you do something online, it is naturally recordable. Clicking leaves logs. Scrolling leaves signals. Searching leaves history. Purchasing leaves receipts. Messaging leaves metadata. Digital systems do not forget by default. They remember because memory is useful. So the migration of life into digital platforms created an environment where surveillance was built in. Not because of malicious intent. Because data collection was the easiest way to run services, debug systems, measure success, and monetize attention. Surveillance became a byproduct of participation. 4. The surveillance trade, convenience for data. Normalization accelerated when services became free. Many platforms offered convenience at no monetary cost. Search. Social media. Maps. Email. Video sharing. The hidden price was data. At first, this trade was invisible. People saw a free service. They did not see an attention and data extraction machine. The trade seemed worth it. And because the costs were delayed and diffuse, it felt harmless. This is how surveillance becomes normal. It arrives as a bargain. 5. Why consent made surveillance feel legitimate. Consent was the moral cover. You clicked agree. So it is fine. But most consent is not meaningful. People cannot read long terms. They cannot negotiate. They often have no alternatives. Participation in modern life requires compliance. So consent functions like a ritual. It creates legal legitimacy. It creates psychological comfort. It allows institutions to say surveillance is chosen. But choice is limited when the cost of refusal is exclusion. Consent helped normalize surveillance by making it feel voluntary. 6. Security fear accelerated normalization. Convenience is one doorway. Fear is another. Security threats, crime fears, and terrorism fears created demand for monitoring. Cameras in public spaces were justified as safety. Airports increased screening. Biometric systems were introduced for speed and security. Digital services increased verification and fraud detection. Each step was framed as protection. And protection is hard to argue against. The problem is not that safety is unimportant. The problem is that surveillance tools rarely stay limited. Emergency measures become permanent. Once infrastructure exists, it is reused. Fear opens the door. Habit keeps it open. 7. I transformed surveillance into automated governance. This is where the modern era begins. Surveillance does not become fully normalized until analysis becomes automated. Recording is one thing. Interpretation is another. AI makes interpretation scalable. It can analyze video feeds for faces and patterns, analyze text for sentiment and intent, analyze transactions for fraud, analyze workplace activity for performance, analyze online behavior for targeting. This changes surveillance from passive recording to active sorting. It is no longer just stored footage. It becomes real-time decision-making. AI turns surveillance into governance. That is why normalization accelerates. Because surveillance is no longer only watching. It becomes acting. 8. The invisible shift, from watching people to watching patterns. A key reason surveillance became normal is that it stopped feeling personal. Institutions rarely say, "We are watching you." They say, "We are monitoring systems." They say, "We are tracking trends." They say, "We are optimizing experiences." They focus on aggregates. Patterns. Anomalies. This language makes surveillance feel less invasive. But pattern monitoring still affects individuals. If you are flagged as an anomaly, the system reacts. You are treated as suspicious, as risky, as low value. So surveillance becomes normal by becoming abstract. People are not watched as people. They are watched as data patterns. This makes it easier to justify. 9. The normalization of tracking through daily tools. Surveillance became normal because it became embedded in tools people use every day. Phones track location. Apps track behavior. Websites track sessions. Payment systems track purchases. Smart devices track routines. Work tools track productivity. Even when tracking is optional, the default is often on. People adapt. They stop noticing. The tracking becomes background noise. Once it becomes background, it becomes permanent. Because resistance usually requires discomfort. Surveillance normalization reduces discomfort by making tracking feel ordinary. 10. The role of default settings. Defaults are more powerful than laws. If tracking is on by default, most people keep it on. If personalization is on by default, most people accept it. If data sharing is buried in settings, most people never change it. Surveillance became normal through defaults. The system does not need to force people. It needs to design choices so that surveillance is the path of least resistance. This is one of the most important mechanisms. Normalization through design. 11. Why data brokers made surveillance harder to see. Another reason surveillance became normal is that it became distributed. You might trust one company, but your data does not stay with one company. It is shared, sold, traded, aggregated. Data brokers collect information from many sources. They build profiles. They sell access. This creates surveillance without a visible watcher. No single actor feels responsible. Responsibility becomes fragmented. When responsibility is fragmented, accountability weakens. Surveillance becomes normal because it becomes hard to point to one villain. It is a system. 12. The surveillance economy, why profit locks it in. Once surveillance becomes profitable, it becomes hard to reverse. Advertising systems reward targeting. Targeting requires profiling. Profiling requires tracking. Tracking requires data collection. Data collection requires surveillance infrastructure. Profit becomes tied to surveillance. If a platform tried to stop tracking, it would lose revenue. Competitors would outcompete it. So surveillance becomes a competitive advantage. Competitive advantage becomes necessity. This is how surveillance becomes locked in economically. Even if people dislike it, institutions feel unable to stop. 13. Workplace surveillance, the fastest normalization. Workplace surveillance normalized quickly for one reason. Power imbalance. Employees have less ability to refuse. Monitoring is framed as productivity and security. Time tracking becomes standard. Communication logging becomes standard. Performance scoring becomes standard. AI makes this easier by analyzing communications and behavior automatically. The workplace becomes a lab. The employee becomes a data source. And because jobs are necessary for survival, resistance is risky. So workplace surveillance spreads faster than consumer surveillance. It becomes normal inside organizations first. Then it influences social expectations outside organizations. 14. Education normalizes surveillance early in life. Schools have also adopted monitoring. Attendance tracking. Learning analytics. Proctoring software. Device monitoring. Behavioral assessment tools. This matters because children learn what is normal in school. If monitoring is normal in education, it becomes normal in adulthood. Students adapt to being tracked. They internalize performance metrics. They accept surveillance as fairness. So surveillance becomes normalized through socialization. A generation raised under monitoring will not feel shock later. 15. Public space surveillance, cameras become furniture. In many places, cameras became part of the landscape. Stores. Streets. Buildings. Transit. People stopped seeing them. They became like street lights. This is normalization at the sensory level. If you do not notice surveillance, you do not resist it. AI deepens this because cameras become smarter. Not just recording, recognizing, tracking. But the physical presence is already normalized. So the upgrade is easier. The foundation was built quietly. 16. Why surveillance feels safe even when it is not. Surveillance creates an illusion of safety. People see cameras and feel protected. They assume monitoring prevents harm. Sometimes it helps. But the deeper effect is psychological comfort. Comfort is powerful. It makes surveillance feel like security rather than control. And because fear is strong, people accept monitoring even when it has weak evidence of effectiveness. The emotional appeal matters more than the technical reality. This is part of normalization. Surveillance becomes linked to safety feelings. 17. The nothing to hide shift. Many people learn to accept surveillance by repeating a phrase. Nothing to hide. This phrase normalizes monitoring by reframing privacy as suspicious. If you care about privacy, you must be doing something wrong. This is a cultural shift. Privacy becomes guilt. and guilt becomes a justification for surveillance. But privacy is not only about hiding wrongdoing. It is about freedom. Freedom to explore ideas. Freedom to assemble. Freedom to change without permanent records. The "nothing to hide" idea helped surveillance become normal by weakening privacy's moral value. 18. Normalization through gradualism. Surveillance did not arrive all at once. It arrived gradually. A feature here. A policy there. A camera here. A data sharing agreement there. Gradual changes avoid backlash. People resist dramatic shifts. They adapt to small shifts. This is how large transformations happen. By the time people notice the full system, it feels too late. And many have already adapted. This is the politics of gradualism. AI accelerated gradualism because systems can change without visible infrastructure changes. A software update can increase monitoring. A policy update can expand retention. A model update can expand inference. No new cameras needed. No new laws needed. Just a new threshold. 19. The normalization of inference. One of the most important shifts is this. Surveillance became normal not only because of collection, but because of inference. AI can infer identity, mood, risk, and preference from patterns. That means surveillance can become less visible. You do not have to be asked. You do not have to disclose. The system can guess. Inference makes surveillance harder to detect. And what is hard to detect is easy to normalize. Because people cannot resist what they do not see. 21. Surveillance becomes a social expectation. Over time, surveillance becomes an expectation. Businesses expect customers to be trackable. Employers expect employees to be measurable. Governments expect citizens to be identifiable. Platforms expect users to be predictable. This expectation changes norms. People who refuse tracking are treated as suspicious. People who avoid digital systems are seen as strange. Society shifts toward a new normal: transparency for individuals, opacity for institutions. This is the key asymmetry. Institutions watch. Individuals are watched. The watchers often remain hidden. The watched become legible. 21. The cost of normalization. Freedom becomes private, not public. When surveillance becomes normal, behavior changes. People become more cautious in public. They express less. They assemble less. They take fewer risks. Freedom becomes something you exercise only in private. But private space is shrinking. Because phones travel with you. Because platforms mediate relationships. Because workplaces monitor behavior. So freedom becomes limited not only by law, but by environment. A surveilled society does not always need censorship. People censor themselves. That is the hidden cost of normal surveillance. 22. Why reversing surveillance is so hard. Once surveillance is normalized, reversing it faces three barriers. Infrastructure lock-in. Systems are built around data. 2. Economic lock-in. Profit models rely on tracking. 3. Psychological lock-in. People adapt and stop noticing. Also, surveillance creates its own justification. Because once it exists, institutions claim they need it. If they remove it and something goes wrong, they will be blamed. So surveillance becomes a one-way ratchet. It grows easily. It shrinks with difficulty. 23. What a different path would look like. Surveillance normalization is not inevitable. A different path would include privacy by default, not by request. Strong limits on data retention. Restrictions on third-party sharing and data brokerage. Transparent reporting on surveillance tools. Independent oversight. Limits on biometric identification in public spaces. Strong protections against workplace monitoring abuse. User control over personalization and tracking. A shift in business models away from attention extraction. These changes are political and economic, not technical. The technology can exist without total surveillance. But the incentives must change. 24. Core takeaway. Surveillance became normal because it arrived through convenience, fear, profit, and design. Digital life made data collection easy. AI made analysis cheap. Institutions adopted surveillance to reduce uncertainty and increase control. And people adapted gradually until tracking felt ordinary. No one voted for this world. It emerged through incentives. If society wants a different world, it must change those incentives. Because without governance, surveillance expands by default. If this episode helped you understand how surveillance became normal, like this video so more people can see it. Share it with someone who thinks surveillance is only a government issue. And subscribe to Uncovering Facts for deep, hype-free explanations of technology, surveillance, and the systems shaping modern life. Next episode, the data economy you never agreed to.